Slavery can and was sustained on a free market. It was sustained in medieval Ireland, which did not have what I would call a state and is otherwise a good example of a stateless society. The reason being that slavery was believed to be legitimate by the general population in medieval Ireland, and this is the only way slavery can be maintained on, well, in one sense, it's the only way slavery can be maintained at all, but I'll get into that in a second. Similarly, in a stateless society, there can be laws against murder, assault, and theft, as well as provisions on how much a husband can beat his wife. Right? Like, an example would be the rule of thumb. You cannot beat your wife with anything thicker in width than your thumb. Right? And that was how one could beat their wife. And that is certainly authoritarian by most people's subjective perception of authoritarian. Laws against theft are sustained on a free market, just like laws supporting slavery and wife beating are sustained on a free market. It all comes down to the belief of the populace. If a given population on a free market would no longer sustain slavery, then a state does not sustain a state can sustain slavery against a free market. And the way this works is that the population doesn't support slavery directly, but does support the state, and the state then supports slavery. I call this proxy support of slavery. The population on the whole isn't very favorable to the slavery laws, but tolerates them. This was helped in the U.S., where racism was rampant, and racism made Americans more tolerant of slavery, since in the U.S. blacks were enslaved, and there were white slaves, and there are also black, there are also freed blacks who held black slaves, but primarily it was white people enslaving black people. I do not believe pro-slavery sentiment was so high that slavery would be sustained on a free market, as evidenced by the fact that black people were employed, when given the opportunity, when not legally restricted, to as high a position as the various anti-black employment laws would allow. Right. So, they got as high as they could on a free market. It was only the state that was keeping them back. And what's more is that it was the state that was keeping them enslaved, because this is why the fugitive slave laws were necessary. Slavery could not be sustained on a free market in the U.S. at the time. The state had to commission a bunch of people to go out and capture slaves. Right? And in fact, individual Southerners would be conscripted to capture runaway slaves. So, it was pretty rampant, as you could imagine, runaway slaves, excuse me. In Brazil, the state simply declared slavery abolished, but didn't do anything about it. Right? No troops were sent out. Like the Portuguese government didn't send troops out, and the Brazilian government didn't send troops out to break up the slaves from the slave owners. Right? Slavery simply ended because the Brazilian state was no longer supporting slavery. They were no longer enforcing the contracts. It could not be sustained on a free market. I do not know of any examples of this, but it is possible. It is possible that a state could end slavery against the free market. That is, you have a society that is pro-slavery, that is so pro-slavery that slavery can be sustained on a free market, but this society also believes in the state. And if this state outlaws slavery, the society may stop having slavery, not because they would have done so on their own accord, but because they believe in state law. And so in the U.S., you had proxy support of slavery. In this example, you could have proxy opposition to slavery, not direct opposition to slavery, but through the state opposing slavery. Now, this is systematically unlikely in a democratic state, because if the population directly supports slavery, then they will vote for a state that supports slavery. However, this could happen in a monarchy, right, where the king opposes slavery the population supports slavery, but the population also supports the king, and so it would be a battle. Like, does the population support the law of the king more than they support slavery? And if they support the rule of the king, then the king can intervene and end slavery, and the population will view that as legitimate. Now, this is the basic idea of progressivism, right? Using the belief in the state to legalize / make illegal actions, make certain things legal or illegal according to the progressive, quote-unquote, ideal. The problem is that there's no guarantee that any, quote, progressive, close quote, movement is going to be made up of people who advance society down the optimal emergent path faster than would have occurred on a free market. In fact, we have very good reason to believe they are not. Most progressives support increased state control of medical services. They support mandatory education camps. They support seizing upwards of 50% of the product of your labor. They support subsidizing non-working people. And they support raising the minimum wage. Right? And of course, the minimum wage is an unemployment law. Right? If you, basically what it says, if you want to work for $3 an hour, that is illegal. Right? And I've been through this in an earlier section on prices and wages. Now, for us, it's easier to see that slavery was something that needed to be ended, but the self-proclaimed progressives of today will cause more harm than good. Their notions of the good are indelibly connected to the system that they are in, and so will view all deviance from this system as a deviation from what is normal, thus will not advocate radical change. Like, they see the current situation, okay, they see the current situation and they see the trend and correctly understand that the world has been getting better over the centuries. Then they make the error by assuming that the current specific trends must be a continuation of the more general trend of improvement through the centuries. That is, universal health care is supposedly part of the long arc of progress that goes back to 0 AD. Right? Opposing the state is not even considered to them because it goes against the current specific trends, or at least is not salient in them. Right? The thinking goes like this. It goes, the world has been getting better over the past 1,000 years. Over the past 20 years, there has been a drive toward increased state control of the economy. Therefore, increased state control over the economy is progress. Right? See that leap? This problem is exacerbated by the fact that most supporters of the free market in the United States do so out of tradition, right? and tend to uphold other traditions. Thus, free market gets lumped in with racism, religiosity, and paradoxically with aggression abroad. However, I will say this, that it is better to dogmatically fall for free market dogma than it is to think for yourself if you're retarded. Right? Like, there are reasons that people follow others, and they just basically imbibe whole cloth what other people believe, and that is because they're not smart enough to think for themselves. And when they think for themselves, they think along stupid lines. So a lot of people are like, say, think for yourself, and they do think for themselves, and they become communists, right? Because, I mean, stupid people, when they're told to think for themselves, they think stupid things. If they just blindly follow free market dogma, right? I mean, they don't have very good rationalizations for what they believe, but they, at the end of the day, they believe a good thing, right? Free markets for the win. Now, of these things that the free marketeers get lumped in with, racism, religiosity, and aggression abroad, of these, racism seems to be the only fair association, but, like, it is not an aggressive or authoritarian racism, but a voluntary racial communitarianism. And perhaps this is technically racism, but it is not like the hateful bigotry that the word racism conjures in most people's minds.